Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in private practice in Harley Street, London. And I'm delighted to be joined now by Antonia Macaro, who's just publishing a fascinating book entitled More Than Happiness, Buddhist and Stoic Wisdom for a Skeptical Age. And this is published by Icon Books. Now, Antonia Macaro is an existential psychotherapist, co-author of the book The Shrink and the Sage, and author of Reason, Virtue and Psychotherapy. She has many years clinical experience in the field of addictive behaviors. She has a degree in Oriental Studies and an MA in philosophy. She was part of the UK's philosophical counselling movement from its early days. So welcome, Antonio, to this Royal College of Psychiatrists podcast. The title of your book, More Than Happiness, Buddhist and Stoic Wisdom for a Skeptical Age. So you draw on Buddhist and Stoic philosophy as providing a kind of guide in how to deal with the predicament of life, the predicament of suffering, and how to attain well-being and happiness. So let me start by asking you, what is Buddhism and what is Stoicism? I know those are very big questions, but if you can give us a brief summary of what Buddhism is and what Stoicism is.
Yes, they are big questions, and it is often said that there isn't only one Buddhism or only one Stoicism, and that there are different versions of these philosophies. But Buddhism is usually considered a religion that was started by the Buddha, who lived in northeastern India, more or less in 5th century before the current era, and he died around 400 before the current era. Whereas Stoicism is a Greek philosophy of a slightly later than Buddhism. It was started by someone called Zeno in around the 300 before the current era. And they are very different, obviously, coming from very different cultural backgrounds, but they do have certain similarities. In particular, they question the fact that, well, the values that we normally hold of life in life. So, for example, most of us value things like success and wealth and health and so on. And Stoicism in particular tells us that these things are not really very valuable, and that the only thing that really matters, that is really good, is virtue, and that is about really valuing our rational nature and our moral choice. So those are the things we should truly value, and all these other things that we normally value are actually indifferent, what they call indifferent. So we should change our value system in that way, and we should act accordingly. In Buddhism, the starting point is something that they call dukkha, which means basically suffering or unsatisfactoriness. Usually it used to be translated as suffering. Nowadays it's translated more often as unsatisfactoriness, which is more general. And it just means that it's not really possible to get satisfaction in this life. It doesn't mean we're always suffering. We can get joy and happiness and so on, but it means that real lasting satisfaction is not really achievable. And so they talk about birth, aging, illness and death being dukkha, and things like not getting what we want, or losing what we want, or getting what we don't want, and that happens all the time in life. So the focus in Buddhism is about ending suffering, and that is a bit complicated, because what that means is a bit complicated, because it's not just about not suffering on a psychological level. It's about ending the cycle of rebirth that we're involved in. And so that is the only way of finally ending suffering. So there is a metaphysical aspect that is very tied up with all the psychological aspects. So that is the focus of Buddhism. And I think that they are similar in that way, in the sense that they challenge what we normally consider valuable in life. And they tell us that actually that is a delusion, that looking for happiness in these things of the world is a delusion. And we should, in fact, withdraw our traditional value to these things and seek a different path, which is different in each of those cases, but there are similarities in what they advocate pursuing in life.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Stoicism. Now, one of the arguments I think about in the book is Stoicism takes a view that human suffering arises out of emotions. So the Stoics are suspicious of emotions and are a little bit anti-emotion. Can you tell us a bit about their position on emotion?
Yes, it's quite interesting because the reason why they are suspicious of emotions is that it reflects that emotions reflect the wrong values. So if we value the things of the world, then clearly we'll feel, I don't know, excitement or joy if we get certain things. We'll feel upset, regretful if we lose them, or and so on. So their aim is to value things correctly. Valuing things correctly means that the things of the world are indifferent, and the only things we value is virtue. So that means that if we really truly valued things of the world correctly, we wouldn't have emotions, because we'd feel a sense of equanimity about them. We wouldn't really feel that our well-being depends on having certain things in the world. So it's not really emotions per se. So that emotions is a sign that we're valuing things incorrectly, and that is why they have that position.
Now, in the book, you say that Aristotle took a different view, that he felt that emotions were not things to be eliminated entirely. The art of life was to strive towards moderation in emotion. So to not to be extremely angry and furious and annoyed, but not to have an absence of anger, but have just the right amount of anger, perhaps the right amount of anger that might attain your goals, though I think that it gets left out. But the Aristotelian position is one of moderation towards emotion, but not getting rid of emotion. But there's a Stoic response to that, which is about, and there's an analogy in the book about running, that while if you're walking, you can stop walking, if you're running, you can't really stop running suddenly. That emotions are a slippery slope and take you into, naturally tend to take you into places of turmoil and disturbance, whereby it's actually impossible to stay within moderation. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's right. And yes, certainly Aristotle thought that emotions should be moderated. It was a big debate at the time. And so he thought that, yes, we should have appropriate emotions. So they should be directed towards the right things, and we should have the right degree of emotion, and so on. So there is a way of feeling emotions appropriately. As you say, the Stoics didn't really buy that. So they, as you say, they thought that in a way emotions just compel us in a way. They just get out of hand, and there's no way that we can moderate them. So I personally am not convinced by the Stoic view on that. I think it is possible to moderate emotions, although it is true sometimes they are very, very hard to moderate. There are certain passions that are very hard to moderate, but I think it's possible with effort. It's possible to moderate them. So I don't think that the runner analogy is a knockdown argument on that. I think it can happen, but I don't think it inevitably happens that emotions get out of hand.
Okay, now in the book you refer to the Buddhist analysis of why suffering is so prevalent in the world as being down to the notion of attachment. Tell us a bit about the link between attachment and suffering.
Well, in a way, it is that particular aspect of it is similar to what we've been talking about. Is that if we value things in the world, then we're likely to suffer. That's on a psychological level. As I said, in Buddhism, it's a bit more complicated because there is a more metaphysical level, which is about the fact that suffering is about being reborn, and so ending the cycle of rebirth is the only sure way of ending suffering. Yes, it's on a psychological level. I think it's a question of of not having a certain reactions towards things. So in Buddhism, suffering will always happen, pain will always be there. So as human beings, we can't, so at least physical pains, we can't avoid. The question is how to detach ourselves from that. So take a bit of a step back so that we don't get too involved with that pain. We accept that pain is there, and we manage to detach from it slightly, so that we avoid a kind of second layer of pain that most of us actually add to the original pain. So it's our reactions that make our pain a lot worse. If we accept the pain and manage to detach from it, then that should reduce our pain. But as I said, that's not really the only aspect of suffering in Buddhism. It is quite complicated, really, what suffering means.
Now, another aspect of Buddhism, or the Buddhist view on life, is the notion of impermanence.
Yeah.
We look around the world, and a lot of things seem very permanent.
Yeah.
Houses of parliament, roads, buildings around us, etc., etc. But the Buddhist view is to emphasize the impermanence. And what's very interesting about this, I mean, for example, it emphasizes the impermanence of your marriage, or the impermanence of your partner, or the impermanence of your children. And what's really interesting about this is when you explain this to most people, they find this a terrifically pessimistic and negative outlook when they first hear of it, I think. But for the Buddhists, this is a very liberating idea. Can you say something about that?
Well, yes, that is. It's in a sense, I think it's a really important thing to start from. That things are impermanent, so there is no point in deluding ourselves that things will last forever. So, I think it's important to accept impermanence, and both traditions emphasize that. Although the word impermanence is primarily used in Buddhism, but in a way, the fact that things are impermanent and out of control. Out of our control is the starting point of the two traditions. The question is what follows from that, because as you say, the thing is that if you emphasize impermanence too much, in a way, it does have certain repercussions on how we feel about different things in the world. It doesn't have to mean that you're detached. It could mean, if you're aware of impermanence, it could mean that you value things more. So like you were saying about knowing that your partner is impermanent, knowing that you yourself are impermanent, it could be just a way of valuing what we have more and enjoying what we have more in the knowledge that it will pass. But that's my take on it. Obviously, for the traditions, the fact that these things were impermanent, that the things of the world are impermanent and out of control, means that we shouldn't value them too much. So that kind of detachment that you're talking about is appropriate according to the traditions. I think there could be definitely too much detachment. So it's a question of how to achieve a little bit more detachment without taking it as far as they do. That is what I would want to take, that there's a balance in becoming a bit more detached and becoming aware and accepting of its impermanence without taking too much of a step back from the people we love and the things we value in life.
Okay, so having discussed the more abstract thinking behind these philosophies of Buddhism and Stoicism, towards the second half of the book, you start translating that through into what does this practically mean for our lives and how to practice the Buddhist and Stoical approach on a practical level. So let's just run through some of the guidance you give there. So the first thing you talk about is self-monitoring as an idea. So what do you mean by self-monitoring?
So I mean that, by the way, some of these practices that I described are my adaptations, as it were, of traditional practices. Self-monitoring was a really important practice in both traditions. And it's really about the fact that we tend to just react to things without really questioning them too much, or without really thinking what values we're really embracing when we're reacting things in a certain way. So what is important is to become more self-aware in a way and start looking at yourself. In Buddhism, this is through meditation. In Stoicism, it's through various kinds of exercises. But the aim is to become more self-aware, to start catching the first signs that of how we're responding to things, whether we're moving away from pain and towards pleasure, and what kind of reactions we have to things. And so that we can, as I said, take a step back and respond to things in a more in a more irrational way, in a way that we've chosen more, rather than just respond automatically, react automatically to things. So it's that starting point of knowing ourselves and knowing our reactions, so that we can start maybe making little changes to how we respond to things. And that's not easy to do, of course, but through practice, it is hoped that I will be able to do a little bit of and to acquire a little bit more autonomy in a way towards how we respond to what happens to us in life.
Okay, now another instruction you give is remind yourself, the aphorism you use is remind yourself that it is a cup. What do you mean by that? Remind yourself that it's a cup.
Yes, that is just, it comes from a quotation from Epictetus, which is about reminding oneself that things really aren't, that things in the world aren't really that valuable. So he says to remind yourself that when you get into attached to things, remind yourself that, for example, a cup, remind yourself that it is just a cup. So then when it's broken, you won't be upset. So Epictetus is quite radical, and so he applies that kind of thinking to all sorts of things, including human relationships. So you should remind yourself, for example, as you were saying, of the fact that your wife will die and your child will die, so that then when that happens, you're not going to be too disturbed. So I think that is a very extreme application of that. I think it's good to apply Epictetus's advice to things like cups. If we break a cup, or the car breaks down, or the roof is leaking, or we lose our job, even things like that, I think it's important to remind ourselves that perhaps it's not as valuable as we might have thought. When it comes to people, I think maybe it's a little bit more complicated. It might still be worth reminding ourselves that a relationship won't last forever, simply because people will die, but then it would be more in the spirit of enjoying what you can while you have it, rather than in the spirit of you won't be disturbed when this person dies, because I think it's appropriate if someone you're fond of dies, it's appropriate to be upset. So in that sense, I actually don't agree with the Stoic point of view.
Okay, another one which is going to catch people a little bit sideways is the headline you gave in this is think about death.
Yes.
What do you mean by think about death? And why should we do that on a daily basis?
Yes. So both Stoicism and Buddhism have practices that involve reminding ourselves of death, and there are lots and lots of quotations, especially in Stoicism. And the intention is that basically reminding ourselves of the fact that these things that we get very upset about are impermanent and out of control, and remind ourselves that they're not as valuable as we think. So it's about keeping impermanence at the front of our mind. And so in Buddhism, there are quite involved things, meditations on corpses and so on. And yeah, it's about reminding ourselves of the impermanence, so that would in a way counter our tendency to overvalue the things of the world. So again, I don't necessarily agree with that particular application, but I think it probably is useful to remind ourselves of death up to a point, for the same reason I was saying earlier, that sometimes we don't, well, these things will end. So it's good to be aware of that. It's good to be prepared, but also remind ourselves that we need to enjoy what we have while we have it. So for me, the application perhaps is slightly different. The other thing that I would say is that it's they are difficult practices, and they can probably have the wrong effects on some people. So if you're constantly thinking about death, it might not be the best thing for your well-being. So I think it's partly about seeing what effects these practices have on you, and seeing whether that it helps your overall flourishing and well-being or not. And I think that even the Buddha said that there was a case in which the monks got really quite depressed after meditating on death too much, and so he basically taught them a different practice. So it's something that can be useful to put things in perspective in a way, but I think it's also something that needs to be watched a bit and done in the right way, so that it doesn't actually make you feel worse about everything, about life and everything else.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the fact that you work as an existential psychotherapist, and that let's talk about the fact that patients come to psychotherapists and they come, let's say, with a problem. Their husband or wife has left them, or they've just lost their jobs. There's a life event has happened, and it's causing them distress. Now, it seems to me that at the heart of your book is an idea, which is to say to people, you've got to take a big step back. You've arrived, obviously, suffering, and suffering is what lies at the heart of life in your analysis in the book. So it sounds to me that one of the things you would do with a patient is not offer them direct advice about how to handle the breakup of a relationship or the death of a loved one, because instead your position would be these things are inevitable, feeling bad is inevitable, and instead let's think about assumptions you're making in coming for therapy, that this can be fixed, and that the natural state of life is one of well-being and happiness, and that the speed bumps that you hit on the road of life are these perturbations of life events. But instead it's the other way round, that actually life is full of suffering, and we need to get engaged with that idea and have a different attitude in general to life, and that's the starting point of therapy. I may not have captured that correctly, but could you say something about that?
Yes, I mean, it is interesting because both these traditions have been used for therapeutic purposes. So, for example, often people say that CBT is based, and REBT are based on, have been very inspired by Stoicism. And mindfulness, the whole mindfulness movement, obviously is based in Buddhism. I can't really say that I use these ideas in a very direct way. I mean, obviously they inform my worldview and the way I look at things. So it would inform the kind of questions I might ask or things I might want to explore. But I wouldn't really want to, because both Buddhism and Stoicism are in a way quite educational, in the sense they ask people to revise their value system. And I don't think that is my place as a therapist to ask people to revise their value system. So, as I say, I might use some of these perspectives. They would inform the kind of threads, perhaps, of the therapy, but I wouldn't use them necessarily in any direct way. I think I think there are separate things. That when Buddhism and Stoicism talk about ending suffering, I think it's in a slightly different way from when a therapist talks about ending suffering, and so it's more of an existential suffering that they're addressing. So there are some applications, but I don't think they can be used as therapy as such.
So, I mean, the book is very persuasive. The book is very well written, and it's a therapeutic experience reading the book. But The book is persuasive in terms of these novel insights into the notion of suffering and what it is to lead a successful life. I'm just wondering how successful you are as a therapist in communicating these ideas in therapy, because I feel that that probably is a bit more of an uphill struggle.
Well, as I say, I wouldn't really aim to do that. As you say, yes, it would inform my thinking. And actually, I find that the therapy that is closest to the perspective of these traditions is acceptance and commitment therapy, because their perspective is that negative thoughts and feelings are normal parts of life. You can't get rid of them. So the aim shouldn't be to get rid of or eradicate negative feelings and have perpetual happiness. They think these things are normal. It's a question of changing our attitude towards them so that we can just carry on with our lives and what they call valued action. So pursue the things we value in life. So they don't have the value system that necessarily the traditions would have as a background. But in terms of how to address negative feelings and what is it important to do, which is pursue things that you value, I think ACT is probably, as I say, the closest. I don't practice ACT, but I find it very congenial for that reason. I think it takes all the right lessons. Well, it may be coincidental, but yeah.
So, I mean, there are many criticisms one could launch at the Buddhist and Stoicist position, but I want to just launch a couple at you. The problem with the Buddhist view, many people I think would argue, is it's too fatalistic and it's too non-problem solving. So a patient arrives having just lost their job, and the problem-solving approach is help them find another job, i.e. do something about it, be action-oriented. The Buddhist position seems to be too fatalistic and one of, unemployment, employment is impermanent, and maybe there are things we can't control. And the problem is we don't know what we can control or what we can't control till we have a damn good try at controlling stuff. Yeah. So there's a problem with the Buddhist approach. It is not problem solving enough. It's not proactive. It's too fatalistic and too accepting. Now, the problem with the Stoicist position is it's just not simply ambitious enough. It says, learn to live your life with a small amount of stuff, and certainly frugality and the approach that maybe we don't need as much as we think we need is fine. But it is also the case that one can be emotionally ambitious. One can have large appetites for life and pursue those appetites and to some extent be happier as a result. Obviously, that route can produce frustration if you aren't successful in pursuing these ambitions. But the criticism of Stoicism is just not emotionally ambitious enough about life. So what are your thoughts about these criticisms?
So about the Stoicism, I first of all, I don't entirely agree with either Buddhism or Stoicism, which was partly the reason why I decided to write this book, because I wanted to extract certain lessons without really taking the whole thing. So I don't agree with the value theory, for example, in Stoicism and so on. I'm not really sure that there's an answer to what you just said. One could say that the Stoics are right in pointing out that things of the world probably will never make us happy. But if someone really wants to live in a different way, just really throwing themselves in the things of the world, I'm not sure they'd be convinced by the Stoic line. So I think it is partly a question of temperament and what you feel attracted to. I think I think there's always something that we can probably take from both traditions, really, even if you don't take on the value system, which is what I was trying to do. But yeah, I agree that there are definitely criticisms. What was the other one that you said about Buddhism? That is too...
Well, it's too fatalistic. It's not problem solving enough. It's not like if you lose your job, let's go and find another job, and let's persist in the face of difficulty. It's kind of, maybe we should accept we can't control whether we have a job or not, and learn to be content without having a job.
Well, I mean, I think in the end, for me, the right answer is a kind of balance between those two things. It's a bit like the Serenity Prayer. It's just, changing the things that you can change and accepting the things that you can't change, which might not be exactly what the traditions say, although there is something of that. I think they're not against action. So in the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, there is such thing as right action. So there is a way of acting in the world that that is considered right. But yes, I mean, you could say that both of them perhaps put too much emphasis on detachment rather than action in the world. But yeah, I mean, for me, it is a question of balance, and I think each person perhaps needs to find their own balance on that. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, Antonia Macaro, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. The title of the book is More Than Happiness, Buddhist and Stoic Wisdom for a Skeptical Age, written by Antonia Macaro, and it's published by Icon Books. Antonio, thank you very much indeed, and it's a wonderful book. I thoroughly recommend it, and thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you so much.